I'm Jennifer Stevens. I work for the Fay W. Whitney School of Nursing here at the University of Wyoming. I am a longtime nurse historian. What is the history of nursing in Wyoming? So that is a complicated question because when we think about nursing, we think about nursing as an action. So it is an action of caring about somebody else. So how long have people in Wyoming been caring for each other? Forever, as long as people have been in Wyoming. If we talk about Gaelic medicine, which is our Western allopathic medicine, that is a different story. The other thing that I like to remind people is that not only did we have Native American healers working here in Wyoming, we also had the curanderos, the Mexican healers as well. All of these different groups coalesced to create this culture of medicine and healing in Wyoming, which was very different from the more modern medicine that we know today. In Wyoming, we don't talk about professional nursing, registered nurse nursing until 1909. What did nursing look like in the early American West? In the early American West, when we first had, again, our mountain men living with Native American communities, establishing those important relationships with the land, they would be practicing native healing. That's where the idea of the medicine wheels come from. The use of plants that we see here in Wyoming, for example, juniper berries, is something that we can associate with this early American West. So who was the first nurse in Wyoming? Well, that is something we may never know, who is the first person who called themselves a nurse in Wyoming, but we do have evidence of some of the first people in the federal censuses who called themselves nurses. So Wyoming became a territory on July 25th, 1868. And in 1869, we have the first Wyoming territorial census. We have 4 people who called themselves nurses. And then if we think about the professionalization of nursing, and the first Nightingale nurse probably was a woman named Elizabeth T. Page Richardson, who was brought here to Wyoming, to the Wyoming State Miners Hospital in Rock Springs. So we might consider Elizabeth Richardson to be the first professional nurse in Wyoming. So who was allowed to become a nurse and who wasn't? Well, the development of standards for nursing is something that occurred over many decades in the later 1800s and into the 1900s. Nursing as a profession was inspired by work done by Florence Nightingale. And so she established several schools in Europe that were considered Nightingale training schools. And those schools had a standard of what kind of student that they would accept. And most of the time, this was young, unmarried women. How did nurses in the American West adapt to the rural environment? Well, I think that nurses adapt to the environment like anyone else would have. The folks that came here were hardy, and it's a difficult environment to be in. So we can imagine that these early caregivers, especially the pioneers, were very industrious and resourceful people. And I have lots of evidence that they were very welcoming to the native folks and the curanderos and anybody who was already here who could offer them some advice about how to treat certain ailments. What is the history of nursing school in Wyoming? So when we think about nursing schools, we're thinking about this formal training as suggested by Florence Nightingale. So of course, Florence went to the Crimean War. She comes out a changed person, a person who was then dedicated to service, to helping those who were ill. And there was a growing demand for a more professional kind of nurse. So in 1897, 1898, we see a movement to to bring nurses here to Wyoming that had been classically trained, now Nightingale trained, and we see a group of them arriving from Ontario, Canada. And one of these was named Sarah Jane Mackenzie. She came to the Rock Springs Hospital to the first formal nursing school program there. And then very shortly, she was recruited by St. John's Hospital in Cheyenne. And so Miss Mackenzie went to Cheyenne and she formed one of the best known early nursing programs here in the state at the St. John's Hospital. So in the late 1940s, the last of the hospital schools closed in Wyoming. There was a transition period into what we would consider formal nursing education at the bachelorette degree level. How did the University of Wyoming impact nursing education in the state? So the diploma nurses who were in the 1900s were being trained in their prerequisite courses, their science courses at the university, and then would go to Ivinson Memorial Hospital for their nurse training, for their hospital training. And then at the end of 3 years, they were given a diploma. So there became a gap in the 1940s when the last of these hospital programs closed. And so we see a transition where leaders here at the University of Wyoming were advocating for a bachelor degree in science with a focus on nursing program. And so indeed, in 1951, here at the University of Wyoming in Laramie, the first Bachelor of Science in Nursing program opened. In 2003, our School of Nursing became the Fay W. Whitney School of Nursing, which it is still labeled today. And currently, the University of Wyoming School of Nursing offers the only bachelor degree and graduate level nursing education in the state of Wyoming. How has nursing evolved over time? So the idea of a nurse, the first time that nurse is suggested in our historic literature was in the 400s. And it was a reference in Latin to a wet nurse. A wet nurse is someone who nurses a child for another woman when that woman cannot produce her own milk. So the idea of the nurse is very old and it's very related to maternity and pregnancy. In 1839, Dr. Joseph Warrington was the first to really outline in a book a nursing guide to instructions for women to take care of other women who had recently given birth. Then we move on to the name we all know, who is Florence Nightingale. And Florence Nightingale was a carer, a female carer in the Crimean War, of course, in 1853 to 1856. So Nightingale had been stationed over in Turkey. And there she made a lot of observations about how to care for patients. And so when she was done with her service in the Crimean War, she developed an idea about nursing, which she published in a book called Notes on Nursing. And the focus of Nightingale and why that she is so well known is that she was collecting statistical data on patients, but she was also writing about nursing environment. So she was promoting in Notes on Nursing things like fresh air, light, warmth, cleanliness, keeping an environment quiet, and diet, which was at the time quite phenomenal in her suggestions. And so Nightingale went back to the UK and she developed this idea of the Nightingale School, where she had training schools for nurses that focused on these different elements. And we call that today a holistic, a whole person, whole body idea of caring for a sick person. In 1894, the National League of Nursing Education was founded. In 1896, the American Nurses Association, which we still have today, was founded as well. So North Carolina was the first to make a statewide registry with parameters on how that you could become a registered nurse, and that was in 1903. Here in Wyoming, the very first registered nurse was in December 1909, and at that time we'd established the Wyoming State Board of Nurse Examiners, and 32 nurses in the state were given the designation registered nurse. What will the future of nursing in Wyoming look like? Who knows? I think that nursing is eternal. The future is under debate, and it is forming in front of us. So I am hopeful as an old school nurse, someone who's very passionate about caring and service, that we will be able to somehow maintain elements of the core of Nightingale nursing. I hope that we'll be able to preserve some of that moving into the future.